Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to get wedged in here. We have some very significant things that are happening today. One is a CRA that I'm very much concerned about, and one that I know that my good friend from Massachusetts would not misrepresent something intentionally. However, this is a little bit more complicated than people think it is. I spoke earlier this week on our need to roll back a lot of these regulations that were handed down during the Obama administration. And we're all a part of his war on fossil fuels. And as you can hear, that war is still going on with some individuals. However, President Obama is gone. And now we have to look at these things, some of these over-regulations. And I have to tell you, Mr. President, that I, for a number of years, chaired the committee called the Environment and Public Works Committee. During that period of time, that particular committee has the jurisdiction over the EPA. And that's where most of the bad regulations came from. When I say bad regulations, I'm talking about the over-regulations that make it very difficult for companies to compete with foreign companies that don't have these types of regulations. And let me just share something that is not very well understood, and that is what a CRA really is. There are a lot of people of the liberal persuasion that would like very much to have everything they could regulated in Washington, D.C. For example, one of the fights that we had was the WOTUS fight. If you ask any of the farmers in America, farmers and ranchers, not just in my state of Oklahoma, but Nebraska and any of the other states, what the most serious problem that they could have, they would say it is the overregulation of the EPA. And if you ask them to say which of all the overregulations that you have are the ones that are the most difficult on farmers out there trying to scratch out a living, they'll say it is the regulation on water. Because historically, we've always had the jurisdiction of water as a state jurisdiction. Now, a liberal would always want that jurisdiction to be in the federal government, in Washington. That's their nature. I don't criticize them for it. They really believe that. Well, if you ask any of the farmers in my state of Oklahoma, they'll say, we don't want that to happen. So historically, it's always been in state jurisdiction with the exception of navigable water. We understand that. Navigable water should have a federal jurisdiction. So we've had this, and in fact, I'll have to say there's a real effort 6 years ago by a senator who at that time was representing the state of Wisconsin and a House member who is representing a district in Minnesota. And those two individuals introduced legislation to take the word navigable out so that the federal government would have jurisdiction over all of the water in the states as opposed to the state having the jurisdiction. Well, not only did we defeat the legislation, but both of those members were defeated at the polls when they came up for re-election on that issue. So the people are clearly on our side. Well, where does the CRA come in? A CRA is something that has been used to really shed light on what we are doing here, and I'm talking about the elected representatives. If you have a regulation that is very punitive to the businesses that you have back home, and then if you go back there and it comes out as a regulation, a senator can go back to his state or her state and say, well, that wasn't me. That was an unelected bureaucrat that did that. You know, I'm opposed to it. At the same time, they have that shield so that people don't really know how they feel. A CRA takes away that opportunity because a CRA challenges a regulation, and then that has to be voted on so that forces members of the Senate as well as members of the House, when it's before the House, to be responsible for how they're really voting. Well, that's what's, it's a way of shedding light. Well, we have a lot of CRAs that are up. One of them is going to be the one that I sponsor, which is the CRA having to do with the regulation that came with the Dodd-Frank bill. It's called Section 1504. Now, as I mentioned, most of the overregulations come from, I believe, actually from the EPA. But this one didn't come from the EPA. This one came from the legislation that was the Dodd-Frank legislation, the banking legislation having to do with financial services. And it's one that, that had one section that had nothing to do with financial services. And that section is Section 1504, and that requires makes all the information public that would come from a bid. Let's say in the United States of America, our oil and gas companies are private sector. In China, it's all government. But if we're competing for an oil and gas type of an issue that might be in Tanzania, then when we're competing with China, then China would be competing as a government. We'd be doing it through the private sector. Well, 1504 says that the private sector has to disclose all of the elements of their bid when they're competing with China. Now, the reason for this initially was so that if a country had leaders that were attempted to try to steal money that was given to them for a certain oil project, they would not be able to do it. Well, you don't have to have all the components of that. All you have to have is what is the top line. How much money was actually sent to in this case, the country of Tanzania. Well, the courts came along. This was in 2013. They said, you know, that's wrong. That's a problem for a couple of problems. One is there's no reason in the world that you should have a mandate to disclose all the details of a report, because that's giving away to your competition how you're making your calculations, giving them a decided advantage over the government-owned company. The other problem that the court cited was the expense of this. Now, we're talking about $600 million a year that would be borne by the private sector in America that China doesn't have to have. So it only punishes those that are within the United States. So after the courts threw this out, the SEC should have reworked the rule. That was their instructions, to rework the rule and say, no, you don't have to disclose every detail of the bidding and how that took place, but just the total amount. That accomplishes the problem that people perceive to be out there, because we'll know that so much money, maybe a check for $50 million would go, but we wouldn't have to break down all of that. The main thing is we need to know, and I think in good government, and I know that was the intent of the legislation to put it in the first place, how much money was going to a particular company. So, you know, some have argued that the CRA is motivated by companies that want to get around the transparency, and that is clearly not the case, and the courts have said that is not the case. Oil and gas companies in particular are longstanding supporters of greater transparency initiatives, such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. That's the EITI. We're pretty familiar with what that is, and that does, it is a multilateral, multi-stakeholder global initiative composed of energy companies, civil society organizations, and host governments. The EITI rules would apply equally to all companies that would be operating in a country. So that would level that playing field, and that does what we have right now. We've also heard those on the left saying that voting to repeal the rule would be in favor of corruption. Yet, importantly, the United States already has in place the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits the payment of bribes to foreign officials to assist in obtaining or retaining business. The federal government is already able to bring civil enforcement actions against companies that violate this rule, and Section 1504 of the Dodd-Frank Act did not change that. So that wasn't changed. That was in place before. It's still in place now. And if we pass this CRA and eliminate that section of the Dodd-Frank Act, 1504, it is not going to change things. Now, there are others in the humanitarian community who have expressed concern to me that the CRA will undermine efforts to fight corruption in other governments around the world. And let me assure you that I support your goal. And the courts were very emphatic when they said this thing should be repealed. In fact, it was taken down by the courts way back in 2013. Well, this came back up again, and so what we want to do is merely comply with what the courts told us to do in 2013, and that is to knock out this with the CRA, this particular section 1504, and go back and rewrite it merely to take out the requirement for a breakdown of all the individual elements of a contract, and that's something that we intend on doing. And you know, I have to say this, and I see my good friend from West Virginia over there, who I think would understands this as well as anyone, and that is, I go back to my state of Oklahoma, and they say to me, you know, you have a president, this is back when President Obama was in the president, who has a war on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are coal, oil, and gas, and I would include nuclear. Now, explain to me, this is coming from my state of Oklahoma, explain to me, if 89% of the power that's generated in America comes from fossil fuels and nuclear, and they're successful in doing away with it, how do you run this machine called America? The answer is you can't. You've got to have these, and I think we all understand. But so what we want to do is have this rule changed so that we are not put at a competitive disadvantage, and we're able to go ahead and compete with countries that have a government-run system, and to do that, we need to rewrite that particular act. Again, the courts had already agreed to that, and that is what we're attempting to do. Now, for those of you who are concerned about the timing and the speed of this CRA, I have good news. The actual rule is not set to go into effect until 2018 anyway. The more swiftly we enact this CRA, the more time it'll give us and give the SEC time to rework it. And this is something that is perfectly acceptable. Some of my critics say, well, you can't come back with a rule that is substantially the same. This won't be substantially the same. And actually, this is what the court recommended way back in 2013. So in closing, I'd like to ask you this one question. If we put forth a rule that makes it harder for U.S. companies overseas, who will fill the void? The U.S. companies have the best labor standards, we have the best environmental practices, and the least corruption of any of the other countries. However, if this vacuum is there, this business is going to go to countries like China and India and Mexico, who really don't care about pollution, they don't care about labor standards, and that is not what we want to happen. So what we need to do is foster a strong competitive environment with reduced corruption overseas for the benefit of those living under these governments. So I invite you, my colleagues, to join me in this effort to do this with this CRA, to repeal Section 1405 of Dodd-Frank and rewrite it so that it accomplishes the goal of stopping corruption and at the same time is not going to put us at a competitive disadvantage. With that, I wrote the floor.